You know that feeling when you're in a conversation about race and suddenly the whole mood shifts. You feel like you have to choose every single word perfectly because you're terrified of saying the wrong thing. If that sounds familiar, well, you're definitely not alone. So let's get into why that really common, really uncomfortable feeling happens. And you know this quote from a student named Emma? It just hits the nail on the head. She literally calls it walking on eggshells in a dangerous place. That's a powerful way to describe an anxiety that can shut down these important conversations before they even have a chance to start. So yeah, that's the big question, right? Why? What is it about this specific topic that makes so many of us feel like we're trying to cross a minefield? Well, some really interesting research offers a kind of diagnosis for that whole eggshell feeling. It turns out a huge piece of the puzzle is an idea that many of us were actually taught was a good thing, the colorblind mindset. And kind of paradoxically, it's this very mindset that can make talking about race feel so incredibly risky. So what is colorblind ideology? Well, it's not just about what one person thinks, it's a whole system of belief. The core idea is pretty simple. If we all just pretend not to see race, then racism will just fade away. But what happens when you apply that thinking to the real world? Well, this way of thinking has some huge real-world effects. For starters, it totally masks what's really going on in society. It shrinks this massive, complicated issue of racism down to just individual people being mean to each other on purpose. And when that happens, any gaps you see between racial groups get blamed on the choices people make, not on the system itself. This makes it almost impossible to have a deep, critical conversation. And that right there is a big reason for that walking on eggshells feeling. Because if the only kind of racism is intentional malice, then any conversation about it feels like a personal accusation. And who wants that? Okay, so if that colorblind mindset is actually part of the problem, then what's the solution? Well, for a long time, one of the most popular tools used to fight this was an exercise designed to help people see exactly what colorblindness was making them miss. So let's rewind to about 1990. A new approach started to gain traction, and the whole point was to be less confrontational. The goal wasn't to point fingers and call people racist, but to try and gently shift their perspective, to help them see the other side of a coin that colorblindness had made totally invisible. And this is where the scholar Peggy McIntosh had this huge breakthrough. She had this realization. We always talk about racism as a disadvantage for people of color, but we almost never talk about the flip side. The unearned, often invisible advantage it gives to others. She called this white privilege. But the real question was, how do you make something invisible visible? McIntosh came up with this brilliant metaphor of an invisible knapsack filled with all these little daily advantages, things you might not even notice, like going shopping without being followed by security, or turning on the TV and seeing people who look like you everywhere, or just assuming your new neighbors are going to be nice to you. These aren't huge luxuries, but they're these small, everyday bits of friction that one group doesn't have to deal with while another does, constantly. For years, this knapsack exercise was a cornerstone of anti-racism work. I mean, it was everywhere. But here's the twist. What if, for all its good intentions, it doesn't actually work the way we think it does? What if it's even counterproductive? This slide just lays out the critique so clearly. On the left, you've got the goal to get people fired up to fight inequality. But on the right, you have what some researchers argue is the unintended effect. It actually makes people more comfortable, more complacent with the way things are. So how on earth does that happen? The critique really boils down to 4 key points. First, the exercise refocuses everything on the self, on personal feelings and identity, instead of on the bigger institutional problems. Second, because of that, it ends up recentering whiteness in a conversation that should really be about the experiences of people of color. Third, and this is a big one, it can create complacency. It gives this false impression that just admitting you have privilege is the same as actually doing something about it. And finally, it kind of restores innocence. It lets people feel like they've done their part and are now one of the good guys without having to push for any real systemic change. This quote from the research really just says it all, doesn't it? The whole exercise can become less about actually changing an unjust system and more about making the people who benefit from that system feel better about themselves. So this all brings us to the real heart of the matter, the core challenge here. If focusing on our personal feelings and individual awareness isn't the whole answer, then what is? This critique suggests we might have been aiming at the wrong target all along. The scholar John McWhorter puts this in such a clear, no-nonsense way. He basically says, look, people are a lot more interested in concrete things that affect their daily lives, like good public transportation or better schools, than they are in workshops about feelings. It just powerfully shows the massive gap between personal reflection and actual, tangible change. So here's the bottom line from this critique. Personal awareness isn't useless. It can be a really important first step. But, and it's a huge but, it can't be the only step. It's not a substitute for the hard, messy, complicated work of actually changing the rules and structures of our institutions. And that leaves us with this giant question. If just becoming aware isn't enough, and the real goal is changing the system, how do we get from one to the other? How do we take that tense, walking on eggshells feeling and actually turn it into a catalyst for real, meaningful action? That's the challenge to really chew on.